this module, what we're going to talk about is the IEEE Center for Secure Design flaws numbers 1 through 3. Before we get started, I'd like to explain this IEEE Center for Secure Design. In the earlier modules, we went through the OWASP Top 10. What they talked about were more implementation bugs, problems within lines of code, particular lines of code, and when you identified a vulnerability, you would just change those lines of code, relatively small scale. OWASP has been around and creating these types of lists since 2010. There's another class of vulnerabilities. These are larger at the design level. These are called design flaws. And we hadn't had a list that would prioritize those issues for us based upon vulnerabilities found in the field until 2014 or 15. And at that point, IEEE, which is a professional society, brought a number of, it was about 10 professionals from a number of professional organizations, industrial organizations, and a couple academics, and to talk about what are the biggest design flaws that we need to be concerned about. Design flaws are particularly important to consider because if you find a design flaw, and that would mean that that security vulnerability was prevalent in large aspects of your system. And so this Center for Secure Design really did us a great favor by creating this list so that we could really understand the biggest problems that are out there. In this module, we're going to go through the first 3 of these design flaws. And the first one is earn or give, but never assume trust. The second one is to use an authentication mechanism. And then the third one is to authorize after you authenticate. First one, trusting. The main thing with trusting is, unfortunately, you can't trust anyone. You can't trust another system. You can't trust a user. You really just have to not trust by default. And then enable trust once you have established that you should trust someone or something. And so just be suspicious of the types of users, be suspicious of insiders. You may think that people who work in your organization can be trusted, they can't. And so, if someone does work for you and you can't trust them, maybe you need to trace their actions in case you need to figure out who did something later. But the main thing is no trusting. With that no trusting, one of a very popular and important design principle for security is called defense in depth. So defense in depth says that there's no one security mechanism that is fail-proof. An attacker will get through it. And so what you want to do is have a number of them lined up so that if an attacker gets through one layer, there's another layer there. The best way to think about this is if you think about a bank. So a bank has lots of money, and then that money is in a safe, and that safe has a combination. So, and one way to look at it is, just put the money in the safe, it's locked up. But a bank knows that that combination lock is not good enough, that a bank robber will get through that if they really want to. So they build up layers. So they put the safe in a vault that has no windows, and it has another lock. And so that's another layer. And then there might be a video camera that is pointed towards the door. So in case someone does get in and an alarm goes off, they at least can see the person. And then outside, there could be tellers that are blocking the entrance. And the tellers have panic buttons that they can push if someone is on their way back there. And then there's security guards by the door. So a bank has many layers. And we need to replicate this type of a thing within our own computer systems. So we have data, and that data would be encrypted. And it's encrypted at rest, it's encrypted in transit. And we have, in order to protect from something like cross-site scripting or SQL injection, we'll have input validation, and we'll have that input validation on the server side, most importantly, as we've talked about before. We'll have input validation again at the client side. Why not? It's just another level of defense, and it might keep some people out. We might use a framework like Hibernate, which will help us in developing secure SQL queries. So, we'd line all of these things up in order to protect the system, and then the system would be placed in a firewall would have authenticated access to get into the network. So again, a whole bunch of layers. And then that's all related to the fact that we don't trust anyone, and we don't even trust our system to protect us from the attackers. So we need to have many layers. So this is just a little funny way. Don't trust them to use the gate. You know, isn't this a silly thing? Hopefully it really is just a picture of that there was actually not one of these anywhere. But, you know, you put up a gate, you know, you're not going to stop anyone. And in our own computer systems, you know, we can think about, oh, if we just have the logging or the login mechanism, and they have to log in to get in, you know, that's all we need. But that's not all we need. You know, they can maybe log in and then use the functionality of a different type of user if they can figure out what that is. I mean, people will get around any initial protection that we put in place, and we need to continue on with other mechanisms. The second principle is to have a foolproof or a robust authentication system. So authentication is the act of identifying someone's identity and making sure they are who we want them to be. So we want to use a reliable authentication mechanism, and we also want to protect from a user changing their identity once they have authenticated. So, you know, some of the things that we need to consider. Bypassing authentication mechanisms. One is navigating directly to a URL. And so this can be a case where maybe a patient logs in to a healthcare system and they know what their capabilities are, but they want to use the capabilities of the doctor. And so they change the URL and try to use the functionality of a doctor. So they're trying to get the authorization for that functionality without authenticating to be that actually a doctor. And so you want to make sure that you authenticate on each page so that they can't do that. What is on the screen here is another security design principle we need to be thinking about is there's no security through obscurity. So what that is to say is there is no security in just making something look complicated. Like, you know, if the user looked over and saw the doctor's URL, and instead of words, you know, in the URL, there was a whole bunch of numbers, you might say, oh, no one would ever guess that string. And put a URL in like that. That's not intuitive, but actually all they need to do is see it, and then they can type it in themselves. So there is no security in just simply making something look complicated. The attacker will get to the other side of something if it just looks complicated. We don't want to have authentication mechanisms based solely on the possession of something, like as long as you're in our domain, as long as you have a certain IP address, as long as you have a certain MAC address, like registering your users and their MAC address of their devices, then we'll let you in. That's not enough. You need to make sure that there's some other mechanism. You want to deterministically derive the session tokens. You know, the session ID, if it's too easy to guess, that is a way, taking over that's a way to impersonate another user and take over their session without authenticating as them. So you want to be very, very careful about the way you generate your session IDs, making sure that they're not guessable. Another part of authentication is that you want to balance usability and security, but mostly depending upon the severity of a security breach in your system, to log people out once that they have some period of inactivity based upon the severity. So, for example, a bank, you know, there's a lot at stake if someone takes over the session of someone at a bank that's logged in at an online banking system. And so maybe you only give them about 1 minute of inactivity before you become suspicious that they've actually left their computer. And, you know, in another domain, maybe 5 minutes, or something like Amazon shopping, maybe it's even 10 minutes is okay. Because you just don't want someone to come over and assume the session of someone else who's left their chair. But you want it to balance it. You know, if we were shopping on Amazon and every 1 minute we didn't type something, they logged us out, we would get pretty annoyed. But when it happens with our bank, you know, we understand, yeah, I understand there's a lot at stake. And so we're more tolerant as people. But mainly you want to make sure that for your system, depending upon the severity of the assets in your system, that you do log people out and make them re-authenticate once they want to engage again. And then the last one that we'll talk about today is authorize. So authorization is the act of checking to make sure whoever it is that has authenticated, it could be a person or a system, can actually perform the action that they are trying to perform. So there's a mapping between the person or the system and the authority that they have, and that is called authorization. What you want to make sure your system has separation of privilege. So if there's a particularly critical operation, you may designate that more than one person has to authorize that operation. So similar to today, there might be, if your company, someone's going to cash a check for $10,000, you might require that that takes 2 signatures, or someone who's going to buy something for more than $10,000. The system might automatically send that request to the supervisor. In our systems, we want to make sure if there are critical operations that enough people has authorized them so that we can make sure that the transaction was actually supposed to take place. And another example of that, there can be in an emergency situation a break the glass scenario that says we're in an emergency, we're going to take the security off, we're going to just make sure that we protect people's lives. Well, the ability to do that, the ability to go into break the glass mode, shouldn't be a decision one person makes. It should be a decision that maybe one person can make and 10 people are notified of it, that kind of thing. So you want to make sure that no one in a system can have too much privilege that can cause them to abuse it. Especially we need to be thinking about the administrators of a system. They have access to a lot. And we want to make sure that we keep some checks on the administrators and make sure that they're not abusing their privileges. There's a number of access control models that are typically used. Access control modules are a way we can map to make sure that people only get the right amount of functionality. So one of the models that we use is called discretionary access control. And discretionary access control says whoever owns the data or the asset in the system can give the privileges to that data or system on their own. So it is, kind of a delegated model. And then another model is called mandatory access control. And mandatory access control says that you look at the person who is authenticating or the system and the clearance level they have. Mandatory access control is often used in military systems, so the clearance level, and then the data itself also has some kind of a level, and there's a mapping between the clearance level of a person and the sensitivity of the data, and that will determine what that person can do. And finally, the model that's actually most common is called role-based access control. And with role-based access control, each user has a role. Like, for example, in a healthcare system, doctor, patient, secretary, nurse, lab technician are all types of users, and that's their role. And then the role is mapped to the functionality that that person is allowed to have authorization for. And so that is probably, I'm going to say, the most common access control mechanism. Some access control best practices, the policies should be persistent and centralized. So what you don't want to do with access control is throughout your code in different places, like it could say, if you're a doctor, you can do this. If you're a nurse, you can do this, all through the code. What you want to do is have a centralized place where there's a mapping between the roles and the authorization that each role could have. In case there's a policy change and you want to change it, you need to go, I'm going to go here, right to this policy area and change the policy. And I don't have to look through, could be millions of lines of code in order to find that line that gives the authority to someone. It's good to use a policy language like XACML. And you can load entitlements from the server side to a trusted source, which means that you really need to not have this kind of business logic for implementing access control beyond the client side, because attackers could definitely tamper if you do that. You want to force authentication checks at all times. As I mentioned before, you don't want a logged in user to then start to use functionality of another user type. If they try to do that, then you need to bring them back and say you're not authorized to do that. So which means you're checking all the time. Not just when they log in. And then back to the trust, you want to deny all requests by default and then only give privileges to the right people. Here's just a little comic that summarizes the state of today. Back in the 90s, which is the left comic, it says on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog, because back in the early days of the internet, you could pretend you were whoever you wanted to. On the right, it's really saying, we know everything about you. We know your age, we know what type of dog you are, we know what you bought last week, we know what you ate last week, and that's really kind of the state of the internet today. Sad to say.